Good afternoon. Welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage on another steamy Monday. I'm hoping the weather or the humidity breaks pretty quick. I've mentioned I'm not a fan, but there's nothing I can do about it. Not bad here in the shop today until I just shut the fan off. But today we're going to talk about a subject that I know all too much about, R&R, and I don't mean rest and relaxation. Unfortunately, I'm talking about remove and replace a transmission. The finer points of pulling it out and putting it back in. And if you get anything out of this video, I hope you make less of a mess. Some people really dread doing it, and that's the first step you need to get over. It's not hard. Well, it is hard work, but it doesn't have to be worsened by the way you go about it. So let's go over the basics. These are some things I was told by a gentleman that I really respected, who's no longer with us. And by watching him and picking up stuff of my own, you develop your own style and ways of doing things. So step one, you're going to drive the vehicle into the bay or outside, wherever you're going to work on it. If you have a lift, that's awesome. Actually requires some different tools. If you're going to use a lift, to go with that, a transmission jack that is 2-stage preferably. A lot of the cheap 1-stage ones, you have to lift the transmission chest high to even get it on the jack, because all they use is a engine crane hydraulic cylinder, and it's way too tall. 2-stage puts it down by your waist, much easier to work with. If you have a vehicle on a lift, the rear end's going to be hanging down, and that can make it difficult to remove the drive shaft, because when the rear end drops, the yoke goes into the back of the transmission, or transfer case if you're talking 4-wheel drive, and it has a slip yoke. But anyway, be prepared to have to lift the rear end back up if you have to. But before you even get that far, whether it be a lift or jack stands, now I worked years in a transmission shop without lifts. We did it all on the ground, all on creepers. To this day, I can hold my head up without using a pillow. I don't use the headrest on a creeper for a long time. I used to watch TV when I worked at the transmission shop. I'd go home at night, watch TV, just hold my head up the whole night. Leaning back on the couch, hold my head up. You just get used to, your neck muscles get accustomed to it. Now, the more I think about it, it's probably why my muscles are kind of tight sometimes, and it's kind of painful because maybe they're just overworked. Anyway, jack stand placement. Put the jack stands away from your work area. I prefer them under the front suspension or forward of the front suspension, between the front suspension and the bumper. They do not belong on the frame rail or whatever part of the car you choose to put them on, exactly where you want to be, sliding in and out to work on it. You see that all the time. I seldom see the jack stands placed in the correct way. More often than not, they're right in the way, and I don't understand why. They didn't watch this video. And in the rear, given the choice, I'll put the jack stands under the rear end so the whole vehicle's sitting at ride height. I got the front suspension and the rear suspension loaded with the jack stands. It's just like it's sitting on the ground, only it's a couple feet higher, and put it up as high as you possibly can. Open the hood. You're not working on a vehicle if you don't open the hood. That's what I was told day one on the job. Because if things go wrong, you need to get to the battery, which you should disconnect. That's the next thing I'm going to say. Or any other things that could go wrong because you left the hood shut. And not only that, the natural light. You need to light up the bell housing area. So open the hood, disconnect the battery unless you're working on a Ford. And the only way to get to the nuts on the converter is by bumping the starter. Make that one of the first operations you do, and then disconnect the battery. Take a light and put it up in the bell housing area. Don't bring the drop light underneath there if you have one. Back in the day, the fluorescent ones were all the rage. We're talking the 80s here. Nowadays, there's much brighter much brighter LEDs and other things you can use to improve your visibility under the vehicle, but put it up in the bell housing area. It's not in your way. The cord's not in your way if it has a cord. Underneath is just going to blind you, and you're not going to see what you need to see. You cast a nice light down over the top of the bell housing, you'll find that your job goes a whole lot easier. If you have a distributor, you know, we're talking older stuff now, and it's in the rear of the engine, pop the 2 or 4 spring-loaded things, whatever holds it on, loosen it up, pull it forward, because when you drop the back of the engine down, when you remove the transmission mount, you're going to break the cap. And you'll find when the engine drops like that, it may be hard to get the dipstick out, but we'll get to that. So now you're prepared under the hood. You're ready to go underneath. You have a choice to make. Depending on the job, depending on who's paying for what, maybe you don't want to drain the oil out of it. Maybe you're going for something else. Maybe you're pulling it out to get it out of the way. Who knows why you're pulling the transmission out? If you're going to be working on it, go ahead and drain it now. Drop the pan. Most transmissions don't have a drain plug, unfortunately, but if they do, wicked handy. Some Chryslers and most Fords back in the day had a drain plug on the torque converter as well. So you could drain most everything, which is really nice. That was not adapted by most manufacturers, unfortunately. So get the oil out of it, or use caps and plugs. I have yokes for anything I'm going to pull out, and just as soon as I can, I'm going to pop like a drive shaft out, stick a yoke in it, always have a bucket underneath to catch it, or some type of, you know, those absorbent pads are really cool. Avoid speedy dry, it's just going to jam up your creeper. Avoid making a mess on the floor or on yourself at all. There's really, you don't have to come out looking like, you know, that guy covered never sees on the meme or grease. It's not that bad. So do yourself a favor and clean up what little spills you have along the way. So you're going to drop the oil out of it. Anything that I disconnect from there on in, I'm going to cap or plug. I forgot to mention while you're under the hood, if it has a TV cable or a detent kickdown cable, go ahead and disconnect that off the throttle body or the carburetor or wherever it goes, because you're going to need to disconnect the other end, and you're going to need the slack that provides. Before I remove the transmission mount, I like to disconnect the torque converter. I like to rotate the engine at the normal angle it's going to be. If you have a GM, this is a wicked handy tool. It grabs onto the ring gear and you can turn it around, take the bolts out one by one, or take it loose like they say down south. That makes me crack up. It's not wrong. You don't need this necessarily, and same as installation. Let's jump ahead to installation. When you're putting the torque converter bolts back in, you put them in almost tight and then back them out a little bit. I have another trick for that. I always have a variety of offset wrenches. So if I'm installing the transmission, I push the converter up against the flex plate by hand. There's a GM where I can get right to the bottom. And it applies also to Ford and Dodge. You just have to stick your hand in the starter hole probably. And I'll go ahead and install one of the converter bolts or nuts. I'll go ahead and tighten it with this. And I like to install it in a position where I have room to move it. So I'm going to put it in over here at the beginning of the opening of the valve house and tighten it up, move the engine over with the tight bolt, and then break it loose. And I should be able to reach the next one, tighten that up, move it over. You get my point. You can rotate the engine with your tight bolt, but you got to back it off until you get them all started, and then go around and tighten them all again. GM's pretty easy. In all cases, you can spin the converter after you've bolted the transmission up the back of the engine. Nothing interferes. On a Ford, older stuff anyway, probably still the new stuff, you have studs that stick through the flex plate. So that's an extra pain lining it up when you put it in. And also, a lot of times there's a drain plug with only one hole, so you got to line that up. But it's not insurmountable. I used to have a little stud that would actually fit on the fine thread stud on the torque converter to help pilot it through the hole. Then I'd take it out when it went through the hole. On a Chrysler, the old stuff, they had the flex plate is just a small piece of metal, looks like an X. And if you were to measure, there's 4 bolts in the Chrysler torque converters. We're talking 904s and 727s. One of those is spaced wider than the other 3. So I always took a tape measure and marked that one. Same with the flex plate. So when I was putting it back in, I'd know which way they went. And if you had one with a weight a balance weight for the engine was welded on the torque converter, like a 360, some of the 360s with a cast crankshaft, I think. Once that was, the transmission was up against the back of the engine and you had selected which part of the X you're going to have that weight in, you can't move it afterwards without pulling the transmission back a little bit. So all things to be aware of. When I removed the transmission mount and cross member, that's not hard, but whatever you jack up against the pan with, I always use a block of wood to spread out so you're actually pushing on the the vertical part of the pan, not the horizontal piece, so you just don't squish in the pan. There's no need to do that. Take it up a little bit, get the mount and cross member out of there. A lot of times you got to snake it around the exhaust. I hate disconnecting exhaust. I will do almost anything to not have to, but sometimes you have to. And then when you lower it down, you finally, to the point, you've got the linkage disconnected and the cool lines. I always plug the cool lines. I always use a flare nut wrench on the cool lines. I take one wrench to hold the fitting in the transmission and my flare nut wrench on the other one and break them loose. I have crow's feet, a flare nut crow's foot, which takes an extension. So you can use a ratchet on the, depending on what you got for room, which is usually limited. But you don't want to cut that. You don't want to patch it with rubber hose. If you ruin the nut for the flare nut, you got to run new lines. There's no getting around that. Especially if it's a customer's vehicle, you got to put it back as good or better as you found it. And patching it with a bunch of crap that's going to fail, not an option. Bell housing bolts. My favorite is the old 36-inch extension, 3/8 drive. An impact swivel, if you have a set, you can use the chrome ones as well. But the impact ones don't flop as much. So when you go up with your nicely lighted bell housing, because you have a light up under the hood, you can find all the bolts. To break it loose, I like 3 varieties of mine. These happen to be snap-on. The only reason we'd go with the snap-on, because we would break the mechanism inside all the time, breaking loose bell housing bolts. When they break loose, you better hang on, wear gloves. It's going to snap a lot and your hand could go against something, so make sure you're on the non-hospital side. Don't pull it toward your face, push away from your face. And I use a straight, the one that angles, and the bent angle, depending on what kind of room I got. And, well, to date, I've broke every bell housing bolt loose I could. Now, if you got room and you got an impact swivel, you can try using the cordless impact, but you'll find that all this length takes a lot of horsepower away from it. So you'll be reducing a 1/2-inch gun probably. And, well, that's up to you. I can't tell you that's a good or a bad idea. When it comes time to reinstall the bell housing bolts, I like to take a piece of paper, put it on the head of the bolt, jam it in the socket so it won't fall out. And then I don't go at extreme angles. I try to get it as straight as possible. And put each one in its hole, thread it in a little bit, and when you pull out the socket, the piece of paper just disappears, of course. So no big deal. And you always want to make sure you go up square against the engine. Don't pull it all in on one side. I prefer to push it up onto the dowel pins without forcing it. Nowadays, you'll find like a lot of the LS stuff, they don't leak enough. With all this gasket technology, the bell housing isn't continually oiled. You'll find that transmission is stuck on there pretty hard. I don't know how many 480s I got just on this property that are broken from either from prying on, or a lot of times nobody got all the bolts. People forget about the top one, or obviously their bell housing isn't well lighted. Because you got to get all the bolts out of it, and then unfortunately, a lot of times you got to pry a lot. And I like to call it applied force technology. That is how much force you can put on something before it becomes junk. And that's an art form. Knowing how and how often to apply force to make something happen to get the result you want is definitely an art form. To get the dipstick out, a lot of times you have to jack the transmission up or down, because as you come down, obviously the tube's going to hit the firewall, depending on how much room you have. So a lot of times you got to go jack it up a little bit more. Sometimes take a wrench around the tube and tap, tap, tap like a 3/4 wrench. Try not to obviously hurt the tube, but it's imperative, and this is where a lot of people fail. When you're done installing the transmission, nobody should know it was ever out of there. A lot of times there's a lot of wiring, and again, back to like a Silverado truck with an LS in it. with the bell housing bolts are studs, and there's a smaller nut, 13 millimeter, holding all kinds of harnesses and grounds and the fuel lines. It's a lot of stuff there, but when you're done, put it all back where it was. It shouldn't look like anybody worked on it. If it does, that's a fail. It should not look like it was forgotten. Unless the engine is locked up and won't turn, there's absolutely no excuse for pulling the transmission out and leaving the torque converter bolted to the flex plate. I see that way too often. I'll see a transmission or an engine for sale and there's still a torque converter bolted to the back of it. No, that is catastrophic on especially today's aluminum pumps. You know, to put forces on them like that, trying to get the transmission out of there, because there's not room to just pull it back. It's not a 4-speed or manual transmission with an input shaft. Even that requires great care, so no reason why that should have to happen. And finally, to round this out, you've got it all back together. You have put in 4 or 5 quarts before you've even started the engine, assuming your transmission is dry. And I leave it jacked up, wheels off the ground, and I'm gonna gently start it and run it in gear while I add more oil. Yeah, I'm gonna know an approximate amount I need to put in, 8, 9 quarts, whatever it's gonna be. And I'm gonna gently run it through the gears, forward and backwards, gentle being the, the prime word here. A lot of times, like I assembled a transmission, 2 transmissions last week. One I used Vaseline on all the scarf cut seals and it air checked perfect. The other one I ran out of Vaseline, so I put it together with the blue goo and it won't pass an air check. I checked it several times. I know it's assembled correctly, but that goo has to release the seal so it can do its job in ATF. So this may take a few minutes while you're gently warming the vehicle up for things to start happening. It shouldn't take very long, but that is one drawback. Things fall together when you like glue the seals in, the rings, if you will, with the blue goo. Blue's, I think, the thickest assembly goo they make, and it holds it in there tight. So you got to let it come back out. And then if everything's still good, no oil's coming out of it, you take it for a road test, gentle, be gentle for the first few minutes. You got to check the oil many more times until you believe it. And it reads the same on both sides of the dipstick. A lot of times it'll look full on one side, not even showing the other, or be all bubbly. So there's nothing you can rush. I think a lot of damage could result and has resulted from improper fluid level just by not giving everything a time to, you know, burp out and be checked properly. So that used to be a whole, you know, we used to road test vehicles for 5 or 10 minutes, and last thing we do is check the fluid one more time. And general housekeeping, if you're a professional, when you're done with the vehicle, there's not handprints along the rocker panels, on the sides of the hood, on the hood, in the interior. Act and be professional. You don't see doctors walking around the hallway covered in blood, right? Well, you should be no different. You don't have to be the stereotypical hillbilly covered in grease mechanic. It's not faster. It's slower to be dirty and messy. You may not think so, but it is. Fact. I mean, you put a guy that can be super efficient and clean. We've tested this area on, long story. Well, new hired people to see how fast they could do something, and they would also judge him on that. I remember one kid in particular had some talent, but he left handprints down the rocker panel and off he went. So anyway, that's today's video. I'm going to go turn the fan back on. Hope you're having, or at least getting through wherever part of the country you're in. Maybe it's beautiful today. But it is summertime, and that's all part of it. So catch you in a couple days. Take it easy.